The Lord be with you. And with your spirit. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Glory to you. There was a scholar of the law who stood up to test Jesus and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law, and how do you read it?" He said in reply, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." He replied to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus replied, "A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wound, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, with the instructions, "Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on the way back." Which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim? He answered, "The one who treated him with mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
My brothers and sisters in Christ, I'm reminded of a young man, not young, but a man, I met some years ago through a friend of mine. It was purely by accident. And I was still in the process of discerning my vocation, so it was many years ago. We'll call him Mr. Martin. And I got to know Mr. Martin pretty well. We would talk regularly on the phone. And I knew that he had a lot of wealth. He lived in a big home. But he drove a very shabby car. He dressed very poorly. His wife had the nice car and the nice clothes. And one day he invited me to go with him to make his rounds, and I didn't really know exactly what that meant. But you see, he was a landlord. He would make his rounds every week collecting the rent from his tenants. And I would go with him, and every Catholic church he went by, we stopped. He stopped and prayed the rosary. And I thought, how beautiful. And then we would go on to the people's homes. But I began to notice early on there was something different here. He'd always go into his trunk. And he'd have bags and bags and bags of groceries there. He would knock on people's doors, and I would see a young lady come out with 3 little kids, no husband, no man in the family. And with tears, she would take the food that he had to offer to her. And after some weeks of seeing that repeatedly, not just one person, but practically everyone he went to, I asked him one day, I said, "Mr. Martin, how do you pay for all these things if you don't collect any rent?" And he said to me, "You know, Ron, God has treated me well in life. He's given me more than I ever deserve. And I have these poor tenants who have nothing. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. Some of them have kids. The husbands don't have a job. They can't pay me rent. I don't even ask. He said, I stopped asking a long time ago. So I do the best that I can to be a good neighbor to my people that live in my properties. And I thought to myself, wow, there's a diamond. This man was a diamond, literally. Because he was reflecting the love of Christ. These weren't people he just passed by or they couldn't pay me rent, so therefore I'm going to call the law and then have them kicked out. Never crossed his mind. And for the 8 years that I discerned my vocation, I spent 6 of them with him every week. I don't think I remember a single time that he collected a single fee or a single rent. Where he got the money from, I didn't ask. But this was a generosity beyond anything I had seen in anybody I had ever met. And I left for the seminary, my first semester there. I got a phone call one day from his wife on his way home from making his rounds. He fell asleep behind the wheel and drove off a cliff and died. And I said, God bless. He's on his way home. Here's a man who deserves heaven. He lived it on earth. He knew what it meant to be good to others. We live in a period today, especially where we have a tendency to water ski over top of people's lives. Just kind of moving along. Modern psychologists tell us that the average thought that we have about a single thing or a single human being lasts in the brain about 8 seconds. It's not much. That's why we have a hard time when we come to Mass. That's why we have a hard time praying. Because our brains are always moving, always on to the next thing. And I said this last week. We're always going on to the next thing. We're always looking for the next relationship, the next lunch, the next dinner, the next this, the next that, and so on. And no matter what I'm doing, I'm never at peace with what I'm doing at this particular moment. I never find God in the here and the now. Practicing the beauty of what St. Lawrence of the Resurrection wrote so beautifully about. Practicing the presence of God in the present moment, here and now. Not to look for him in the past or in the future, but here. He is here. But since we simply water ski over top of life, we don't have time to step into the lives of human beings and leave footprints in their lives. You see, this man, Mr. Martin, didn't simply water ski over people's lives. He cared. He left a footprint. And the footprint was charity. An absolute love that asked nothing in return. And all of us, when we are baptized, receive 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. 2 of them will die when we die. Faith and hope, love will always be there. Love will always remain. And we're not talking here about a human love. We're not talking about an emotional love. An emotional love can't get the human soul into heaven. It's only that infused love that grows within the human being in his life. Love for God above all things and for all things that God has created. And the reason we have become so selfish in the modern world is because we no longer love the Lord our God with our whole heart, soul, being, strength, and everything that we are. We got too many other things that are obstacles to that love. And I often like to explain to people, it doesn't matter whether a bird is held down with a chain or whether he's held down with a fishing line or a sewing string. It doesn't matter. He's held down, he can't fly. We allow the world to stand in the way of loving God with our whole heart, soul, mind, and being because we are too busy moving from one thing to the next. And like I said in my homilies, and I said it last week, and I think I said it a week before, and I said it again this week, how many people leave the church after communion time? Why? I used to think there was a vacuum cleaner truck drove by and sucked them out the door. But that's not it. I learned to realize and understand it's the mind. The human being is always moving. He can't sit still. Silence frightens him. He can't sit still long enough to experience God. We come to Mass Sunday after Sunday to experience God. That's what we're here for. That's what we're baptized for. St. Augustine made that very clear. In life, we are baptized to receive the Eucharist, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of the living God. My life isn't about who I'm going to marry, who I'm dating, what school I'm going to, what car I'm going to drive, how much money I got in the bank, what my last name is, and so on and so on. My life is about God. When I was baptized, all of us, our focus should have been God. To love God like our gospel says today, the Lord your God with all your heart, being, strength, your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And this is where we fail. The reason we can't love our neighbor as ourselves is because we don't love God. God made every neighbor, every human being. And we're not talking here about people next door. We're not talking here about people in my building, my house, whatever. We're talking about everyone. An example that he gives us today and that we have in today's gospel, which is one of the most well-known parables. Outside of the prodigal son, it is the one that is most often repeated. It is the one most written about in the early church fathers. But it is also said that this, what Christ was telling here in a parable, was an actual experience of a man on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho, which was a 21-mile-long journey. The priest was coming from Jerusalem. He was heading down to Jericho, probably from having offered thanks to God. He probably still smelled like incense. That man that was laying in the ditch was one of his own. He was an Israelite. That man simply looks and he walks by. And then you got a Levite who comes. He's on his way to Jerusalem. He's on his way up to Jerusalem. He does the exact same thing. And the early church fathers simply called them the two bad men who gave a bad example. And out of nowhere comes a Samaritan on this road, which was nicknamed the Highway of Blood. You didn't walk on this road by yourself. You always went with guards. But this man found himself on this road without guards, and needless to say, he was almost beaten half to death. And the ones that should have stopped and helped him didn't. because they were the same culture, the same language, and worshiped the same God. A Samaritan comes along, and the Samaritans are enemies with the Jews. Still today. Still today. Nothing has changed in 2,000 years. Some years ago when I was in Jerusalem, I remember we took a trip. We went to Jacob's Well, which was by this time a 200-foot deep well. But it had the coolest water in it. When the guy brought it up with the bucket, it was colder than the water you drink out of a freezer almost. One of the best tasting waters I've ever drank. But our guide told us, he said, look behind you. So we all turned around and looked. He says, you see that temple back there? I'm thinking now it's a Catholic church. Didn't look like a synagogue. Didn't look like a place where the Muslims worship. And he said, do you know what that is? I said, no. He says, that is Samaria. That is the temple of the Samaritans. Jews to this day do not step foot in Samaria. And the Samaritans don't go in the Jewish area. We were talking about 2,000 years of hatred. Now, you might say to yourself, wait, they don't have the Christian Christian understanding, the principles of what it means to be a Christian, but they have the understanding of charity. They have the understanding of what it means to help another human being, especially one who is half dead laying on the side of the road. And in modern terminology, the way we would do that is we'd go to St. Vincent de Paul and say, hey, there's somebody standing on the corner who has a need. Can I send him over here? Yeah, it happens. What about us helping others? All of us have seen the people on the side of the road with the sign, help needed. They'll work for food, need money for gas, so on and so on. How easy it is at that moment to judge that human being. Oh, they're a liar. They're deceiving. They probably got thousands and thousands of dollars in the bank. They probably driving a Cadillac and so on and so on. This is a scam. I'm not giving them anything. What if they buy drugs or alcohol with it, huh? Any excuse that I can use for myself, not to reach into my pocket or my purse to detach myself from what I hold on to so dearly. The almighty dollar. I don't want to give it. So therefore, I roll the window up, turn the radio up, or talk to somebody on the phone, pretend like I don't see them. We've all done it. Go to Albuquerque, New Mexico. I spent many years there. We had a homeless problem there. And the council in Albuquerque got together, and they were going to decide whether they're going to build for them a homeless shelter. There was too many of them. They were on every corner you can possibly imagine, every traffic light, every stop sign, everywhere you went, and it was only getting worse by the day. And they realized no matter how big the center they built, they couldn't put them all in there. So they simply voted to leave it. They left it up to the people in Albuquerque to be generous enough to help the people standing on the side of the road. How many times have I been behind people, everybody driving by? And I would stop. And I would hand them whatever, without question, without second guessing, without judgment. And I would drive on. And all of a sudden I noticed behind me people were doing the same thing. You see what a good example can do? Being a good example to others allows other people to be good as well. Nowadays, it's hard for us. We don't want to step so far out of boundaries that somebody might say, what'd you do that for? He's probably just a bum. He's probably going to buy alcohol and drugs. And remember this, you're never accountable to God for anything that you give to someone and what they do with it. You're never accountable to God. But you are accountable for not giving or giving. That's an opportunity you have for today, tomorrow. We need to stop lying to ourselves. Because this parable that we read today, every single one of us, I guarantee it, tells themselves, I am the Good Samaritan. Really? How many times have I driven by people? How many times have I avoided people because I don't want to help them? How can I even put myself in that category? And you see, the Good Samaritan didn't just surf by him by saying, here, have a drink of water, and I hope everything gets better, and Godspeed. He stepped into his life. He left a footprint. He put him on his pack animal, took him to an inn and paid for him to stay there, and told the inn owner, whatever he needs, give it to him. I will come back in a couple of days and pay for it. You see, charity, the theological virtue of charity is expansive. It is something that grows within the human being, love for God and love for everything He's created. We don't want to see people suffer, at least we're not supposed to. Part of the aspect is that many of us haven't suffered enough. We don't know what it's like to really suffer and be in that kind of situation. Should we ever find ourselves on the side of the road with a sign that says, please help, I only hope and pray you're standing on the street corner and I drive by. Because most of the time, people won't stop for a moment to give a dime. It's sad. I'm reminded of a story. I'll end it with this story, too, since I began with the story. But another story in the lives of one of our saints, St. Sister Faustina. If you ever read her diary, you'll remember the experience she had. It was just before the Second World War in Warsaw, Poland. 1937, the war comes to Poland, 1938, 39. The sisters have no food. The little bit that they can grow is beets. So they have one meal a day, beet soup. And it was Sister Faustina's duty to not only work in the kitchen, to prepare that bowl of soup, that meal for that evening, but it was also her responsibility to answer the bell when somebody came by to ring the bell. And up to this point in time, she was able to feed the poor when they came. Mother Superior tells her one day, please don't give our food away anymore. We will not have enough for the sisters. Sister Faustina didn't become flustered. She didn't become frustrated. She prayed. And wouldn't you know it, the next day there's a tug on the bell. She goes running out. She opens the door. And the way she describes it, she was just not used to seeing a beggar that disheveled. He had leaves in his hair. His hair was all messed up. His clothes were rags. He smelled funny. And he asked for a little something to eat. And Sister Faustina thought for a moment. She didn't want to break the rule, so she did the only thing she could do. She invited the beggar to come into the kitchen. She sat him down, cleaned him up, went to the stove, And she decided, yes, Mother said not to give the sisters' food away, but she did not forbid me to give my bowl of soup. So she decided that night she was going to go to bed hungry, so this poor beggar can eat. So she takes the bowl, she ladles in her portion. She turns around to give it to this poor beggar, and guess who's sitting there? Yes. It's Jesus Christ himself. All of his clothes, his dirty clothes, had fallen off. The leaves were laying on the floor. And there he was in absolute radiance. Too beautiful to even describe. With a smile on his face, and he disappeared. Do you see, that's charity? That's charity that steps into the lives of human beings. It doesn't ski over top of people's lives like they don't exist. These souls are willing to give of their last penny. They're willing to give of everything, no matter how difficult, no matter what the cost. We often like to tell ourselves, we love God, we love our neighbor, and so on and so on. Oh my gosh. How far from a reality is that fact? We don't like people with particular skin colors, particular languages, because they cross the border illegally, so on and so on. We just don't like them. We judge them, condemn them, and we'll do absolutely nothing if they ask for something. Because we're too hard of heart. We've not learned to love God and to love the people he's created. Now here in this particular area, of course, we get a lot of visitors. We have a Spanish Mass here. We have a lot of Spanish people working in the area. Most of them are probably undocumented. But do you think for a moment that when they come to receive communion, they come to church, that anybody's going to ask them for a green card, huh? God comes to them as well as he comes to you and to me. They don't run out the door after communion because they got someplace to go. Because their mind is filled with so many things, they got out the door they go. They stay in church. They kneel to receive communion. They're more pious than most people I've seen. But like I said, we have forgotten. It's sad. We have forgotten what it means to love God and to love everything that he's created, and that's what this parable reminds us of today. So if I can give you anything today to take with you, stop skating past people like they don't exist. Step into their lives. Help when you can. You see, charity, one of the beautiful things about theological charity, theological virtue of charity, it allows you to recognize a need before it is ever expressed. If we're not at that point yet, then we need to work on it.